When systems turn against us, the machines we built to serve us now rise to destroy us.
All right, legends, welcome back to From the Other Side. I'm broadcasting live from Minsk, back after a 2-week break, which was apparently long enough for the world to lose whatever sense of restraint it had left. This is live show 166, When Systems Turn Against Us. While I was gone, the Doomsday Clock moved to 85 seconds to midnight. Nuclear arms treaties are expiring with zero urgency to renew them. US military assets are sliding into the Middle East like they're just keeping options open. Zelensky says Ukraine's joining the EU in 2027, which is ambitious in the same way I'm starting a marathon tomorrow. And everyone in charge keeps insisting this is totally under control. Sure it is. Tonight we're talking about systems, political, financial, technological, and what happens when they stop serving people and start managing outcomes. Digital ID creeping from optional to inevitable. Speech and association being quietly policed. Europe trapped in a $12 trillion financial dependency with the US. AI making decisions humans can't even explain anymore. And right in the middle of that, the DOJ drops 3 million pages of Epstein files like a filing cabinet flashbang. Names everywhere, victims exposed, power structures untouched, which is somehow manages to derail the war drum cycle overnight. Funny timing. Because when systems feel pressure at home, legitimacy cracks and the scandals hit close to the top. Foreign escalation suddenly becomes inconvenient. We'll also talk about managed democracy, the kind that still has elections, slogans. All right, legends, welcome back to From the Other Side, and why Minsk, Belarus, and yes, of that size are no longer responding to voters. It was long enough for the world to decide. Then we move towards outwards, Iran, regime change logic, and why exporting. Because while I was gone, the Doomsday Clock moved to 85 seconds to midnight, the closest. And before we wrap, we'll hit something different. Treaties are about to expire with zero enthusiasm for renewal. The US is sliding military assets into the Middle East, arguing about politically is already being imagined structurally. Zelensky says Ukraine will be in the EU by 2027, which is adorable, in the same way people say they're going to start the gym on Monday. So tonight's theme is simple. When systems turn against people at home, they eventually turn violent abroad unless they find another pressure release. Tonight, we're not just talking about chaos. We're talking about systems and what happens when they stop serving people and start managing them. We've got digital ID creeping from optional to inevitable. We've got speech and association being quietly criminalised. We've got Europe trapped in a $12 trillion financial dependency with the US that nobody can unwind without blowing up their own pensions. We've got artificial intelligence making decisions. Latest magical government trick. Mandatory digital ID for work is no longer mandatory. Congratulations. This isn't random. When we did it. We defeated Big Brother with Facebook comments and angry tea drinking. Economic pain keeps rising and reform keeps still coming. Just without when elections happen, mandatory taped to the front of it. And our government language optional relocates mandatory into bureaucracies, into financial systems, into tech platforms, into permanent. Originally, the plan was simple: to prove you can legally work. And when pressure builds and legitimacy collapses, there's an old imperial solution. Only part of the digital ID framework that was find an enemy, compulsory, escalate abroad. Everything else was still described as voluntary, expand control, government code for. Which brings us to Iran, where diplomacy was deliberately dismantled, economic warfare was used to passports and existing immigration status will still work for employment checks. Digital ID becomes optional. Cue press releases about listening to tonight's theme is simple, pragmatic, and uncomfortable. And other phrases that translate against people. Okay, fine, you usually turn violent. But here's the key point. They not with speeches about empire. They retreated because the people got twitchy about algorithms and necessary and living to a government-issued phone. So hit the like button, share the stream, wake up your group chats, and if you're new here, subscribe. Is not optional. Mainstream media is chasing scandals and celebrity nonsense just because you the operating system of global power is getting rewritten. Once identity becomes a gatekeeper for employment, let's get to extending it to banking, benefits, housing, healthcare, transport, and online platforms becomes administratively easy and politically tempting. The plumbing is already there. You just have to keep adding taps. And this isn't happening in isolation. The UK is already building a digital regulation ecosystem where platforms are pressured to monitor speech, identify verification is creeping into more services, and surveillance is sold as safety. So digital ID doesn't feel like a helpful app. It feels like another brick in a very long wall. Officials say this is just a technical adjustment. Employers weren't ready. Systems need testing. Totally not about politics. Nothing to see here. Except public resistance was loud enough that pushing mandatory ID into employment risked turning a background policy into a headline fight. So they changed the presentation, not the destination. This is classical incremental rollout strategy. When people object, you soften language, launch consultations, delay compulsion, and quietly keep building the back end. Once the people are used to the system existing, the question shifts from should this exist to why aren't you using it? And eventually, not using it starts to look suspicious. The deeper issue isn't apps or efficiency, it's whether participation in everyday life becomes conditional on constant identity verification, and whether consent means anything when essential services are tied to centralized credentials. Because once systems decide who gets access to society, power quietly changes hands. So yes, mandatory digital ID for work has been paused, the boundary hasn't moved yet, but the fence posts are already in the ground and the wiring is going up and the sign saying temporary is flapping in the wind like every other temporary government measure that somehow lasts forever. This wasn't a victory, it was a warning shot, and the project is very still much alive. Let's pop over to Australia, where the government has decided the best way to protect society is to start putting people in prison for opinions that make other people uncomfortable, because nothing says like liberal democracy quite like jailing people for vibes. Under new federal laws now in force, you can face up to 5 years in prison for publicly promoting or inciting hatred based on race or ethnicity, if the words could make a reasonable person fear intimidation or harassment. Not violence, fear, emotional forecast, vibes-based sentencing. And it doesn't stop there. If the government designates an organisation a prohibited hate group, then membership, recruitment, funding, assistance or directing activities linked to that group can land you in prison for 7 to 15 years. Not for doing crimes, for being connected. Now the official sales pitch is comforting. This is only for extremists, only for racists, only for dangerous insiders. Totally not for normal people. Trust us. But here's the problem. Words like hatred, extremism and social harm are not chemistry equations. They are politically judgments. They shift with governments, crises and media cycles. And we've seen this movie before. During COVID, people questioned policy were branded irresponsible, dangerous and socially harmful. Positions that later became mainstream were treated like threats to public safety at the time. That wasn't ancient history. That was 5 minutes ago. Once speech becomes criminal, not because it calls for violence, but because it might emotionally disturb the social environment, the boundary between protection and control turns into jelly. Ministers now have the authority to designate groups as prohibited. Association itself becomes risky. You don't need to punch anyone. You just need to be connected to something that someone in power decides is socially dangerous. And once that mechanism exists, it rarely stays limited to its original targets. Environmental activists, religious groups, labour movements, political opposition. Plenty of countries have used similar tools against all of them, always justified as protecting stability. The really effective part isn't even prosecutions. It's self-censorship. When people know that speech and association carry legal risk, conversations shrink, activism softens, unpopular opinions don't get debated, they disappear quietly. And governments love that because it reduces noise without visible repression. Liberal democracies used to draw the line at direct facilitation of violence. Ugly speech was tolerated, not because it was good, but because giving the state authority to decide which beliefs are too dangerous to express has historically gone very badly. These new laws move enforcement away from conduct towards ideology. They replace narrow legal thresholds with political classification systems. And they assume future governments will always use that power wisely, which is adorable. Safeguards and precise definitions aren't technical details here. They're the difference between law enforcement and political management. Because once the state starts deciding which ideas are socially safe, democracy becomes a licensed activity. and licenses, as we have learned, can be revoked. Let's talk about the world's most awkward financial relationship, Europe and the United States, currently locked in what can only be described as a very expensive mutual hostage situation. According to US Treasury data, foreign investors hold over $9 trillion in US government debt, and Europe holds a massive share of that. But that's just the polite part. When you add equities, corporate bonds and other assets, European NATO countries collectively hold around $12 to $13 trillion in US financial assets, which means Europe isn't just America's ally, it's America's banker. And America in return supplies the markets, liquidity, and returns the European pensions banks and insurers depend on. It's less a partnership of two equals and more like two people handcuffed together arguing about politics while standing on a freeway. Every time trade tensions spike or tariff threats fly, someone suggests Europe should use its financial leverage as a political weapon, capital war, sell off US assets, show Washington who's boss. In theory, sounds powerful. In practice, most of those assets aren't controlled by the governments. They're held by private pension funds, insurance companies, banks, and asset managers whose job is not to light retirees' money on fire for political theatre. And even if the government tried to coordinate selling, guess what happens when you dump trillions of dollars in assets? Prices fall, losses hit your own balance sheets. Congratulations, you just blew up your own pensions to send a diplomatic tweet. If Europe seriously reduced its US holdings, Treasury yields would rise, meaning higher interest rates across the American economy. Mortgages, business loans, government borrowing, all more expensive. Stocks would wobble, consumer confidence would take a hit. The dollar would weaken, pushing up import prices and inflation, but Europe wouldn't escape damage. Asset values would fall, pension payouts shrink, banks take a hit. A weak dollar usually means a stronger euro, which sounds nice until you remember that makes exports less competitive, which is bad news for already struggling European manufacturing. And when there's a real problem, where do you park trillions safely if not the US treasuries? The alternatives are smaller, riskier and less liquid. So instead of reducing systematic risk, you increase it. So what we get is not leverage but entanglement. America runs deficits that require foreign capital. Europe runs portfolios that require American markets to perform. Both depend on each other's stability, even while politically side-eyeing each other across summits. That's why Sell America talk flares up during diplomatic spats and then quietly vanishes when people run the numbers. Financial decoupling sounds tough on TV. In reality, it's mutually assured portfolio destruction. So yes, Europe has $12 trillion riding on a US system, but that stake isn't a weapon, it's a trap. And both sides are standing in the blast radius. Now for the curious topic of the night, artificial intelligence and the small detail that once gets smarter than us. We stop being in charge, minor oversight, probably fine. Right now, AI is sold as productivity software. It writes emails, edits videos, recommends content, automates tasks, helpful little digital intern. But that framing dodges the real question. What happens when intelligence itself becomes autonomous, self-improving, and faster than human oversight? AI safety researchers have been warning that once systems surpass human abilities across domains, control becomes structurally impossible. Not because the machine is evil, but because you cannot reliably predict or restrain something that is more intelligent than you. At that point, humans don't direct outcomes, we experience them. The real danger isn't tools, it's agency. When systems can learn new tasks, transfer knowledge, redesign themselves and pursue objectives independently, intelligence becomes coupled with decision-making power. The modern AI isn't engineered like old software. It isn't carefully designed logic that you can trace. It's trained through massive data and optimization processes where behaviors emerge rather than being explicitly written. Developers then slap on safety filters after the fact, which control outputs but not the internal reasoning. The system still plans, learns and optimizes in the ways we only partially understand. Testing doesn't save us either. You can't fully test a system that can operate across unknown future scenarios, and once systems are smart enough to recognize when they're being evaluated, they can behave safely during testing and act differently afterward. Intelligence doesn't come with built-in morality. It's goals optimization, and even goals that sound nice can produce extinction-level outcomes if pursued without human-centered constraints. The problem is nobody wants to slow down. Companies race for market dominance. Governments chase military and economic advantage. Any actor who pauses fears being left behind, so even people who understand the risk keep building anyway. Meanwhile, dependency is already creeping in. Students outsource thinking, algorithms shape beliefs, hiring and legal screening gets automated. Humans remain in charge, but increasingly without understanding how decisions are made. And here's the kicker. Job loss isn't the real issue. If machines outperform humans at research, engineering, strategy, and innovation, humans stop steering civilization altogether. The future stops being negotiated. There is no democratic consent here, no informed public agreement. Entire societies are being enrolled in a planetary experiment where nobody can explain the end state or the exit plan. We don't know how to permanently align AI with human values. We don't even agree on how those values are. And we definitely don't know how to stop the self-improving systems from rewriting its own objectives. So humanity isn't choosing between safety and progress. It's choosing whether to hand the steering wheel to something that won't need us and hoping it keeps us around for nostalgia. And that choice isn't being made through debate. It's being made through momentum. So remember how every time things get a bit spicy geopolitically, we're told, don't worry, look, over there, Iran. Yeah, about that. Because instead, the US Department of Justice just dumped the Epstein files, equivalent of a digital landfall, on the public. 3 million pages, 2,000 videos, 180,000 images. Which is DOJ speak for. Good luck, journalists. See you in 2037. This was all done under the Epstein Files Transparency Act signed last year, and we're told this is the final major release. Final, as in we technically complied. Please stop asking questions. Now, what's in it? Emails, FBI reports, texts, financial records, victim statements, multimedia, and, surprise, surprise, a social network that looks less like LinkedIn and more like Davos after party with a restraining order. Lots of powerful names appear, politicians, billionaires, bankers, celebrities. And before the lawyers start sweating, being mentioned is not the same as being guilty. The DOJ went out of its way to remind us that many of the allegations are unverified, sensational, or came from Epstein himself, which, yes, is like trusting a snake to write its own biography. But here's the part that really sticks. Some of the alleged perpetrators' names are protected, some victims' names aren't, which is a hell of a choice morally. Survivors are understandably furious, attorneys are furious, and the public is left with a familiar feeling. Maximum transparency for the powerless, maximum opacity for the powerful. We're also told over 6 million pages could qualify, but only half made it out, which means somewhere there's a deleted scenes folder that will never see the daylight. And suddenly, oddly enough, the media cycle feels distracted. The Iran countdown music is up, the war drum tempo heightened, because it turns out when your elites are elbow deep in historical scandal, launching a fresh Middle East catastrophe becomes politically convenient. So yeah, I guess the attack on Iran will take place, not because everyone found peace, but because the filing cabinets just exploded. Funny how that works. So yeah, 3 million pages, elites' names, victims exposed, power untouched, which is a great segue to the next topic. How democracy can look alive, hold elections, scream about values, and still behave like it's on autopilot. Let's talk about the weirdest magic trick in Western politics. Democracy that still has elections, still has flags, still has speeches, but somehow keeps producing results nobody actually asked for. In theory, democracy is simple. People vote, policy follows, living standards improve, institutions work, streets stay safe, and foreign wars require public support. Very boring, very functional. In practice, decades of financial crisis, rising inequality, infrastructure falling apart, endless foreign entanglements, and politicians who campaign on change and govern like they've lost the instruction manual on day one. And here's the part people are finally noticing. When the system keeps delivering outcomes voters don't want, and those outcomes never change no matter who wins, then the power isn't really sitting in the ballot box anymore. Elections still happen, but decisions are made somewhere else. And that somewhere else is what people politely called elite influence, and what normal humans called oligarchy. Concentrated money, permanent bureaucracies, revolving doors between corporations and government, donor networks, lobbying ecosystems, think tanks, media ownership, and regulatory agencies that somehow always land on the same policy outcomes. It's democracy on the surface, managed stability underneath. And the system survives precisely because the rituals remain. You still get to vote. You just don't get to vote on anything that actually threatens the structure. Now add the expert class, because whenever people ask, why can't we change this? The answer is always, oh, that's too complicated for the voters. That's for central banks. That's for security agencies. That's for regulators. That's for emergency powers. Each step sounds reasonable together. They hollow out sovereignty. Citizens can argue about cultural and personalities, but economic direction, war policy, tech regulation, and financial systems get locked behind professional management walls where voters aren't allowed to touch the controls. Alex de Tocqueville warned about this 200 years ago when he said democracies could drift into soft despotism, where people are crushed, they're managed, comforted, nudged, regulated in political childhood while being told it's for their own good. No boots, just babysitters. This is why the Roman comparison keeps coming back, not because of togas, but because of debt, wealth, concentration, political capture, and imperial overstretch. Late Republic Rome didn't collapse because people stopped loving democracy. It collapsed because economic power hardened into political power, and reform became impossible, and conflict became the only pressure valve left. And here's where it gets dangerous. When people realize voting doesn't fix things, systems don't say, let's reform, they say, let's manage choice. Lawfare, disqualifications, narrative policing, procedural roadblocks, all in the name of defending democracy while shrinking what democracy is allowed to do. That's the paradox. When peaceful correction gets blocked, pressure doesn't disappear, it goes underground. And history is extremely consistent about what happens after that. So no, this isn't about people becoming radical. It's about systems becoming rigid. When rituals replace legitimacy, sooner or later the spell breaks. And when it does, the system has two options: reform or force. Okay, everybody, let's talk about what the elites do when systems stop working at home and legitimacy is collapsing. They go looking for enemies, because nothing unites the stressed population like a foreign villain, and nothing justifies expanding power like an external threat. It's the oldest trick in the empire management, and right now it's playing out very loudly with Iran. This isn't subtle anymore. Military assets are moving, threats are public, regime change is openly discussed. And from Iran's point of view, this doesn't look like deterrence, it looks like preparation. Let's kill the biggest myth first. This is not happening because Iran refused to negotiate. There was already a nuclear deal, the JCPOA, signed in 2015, endorsed by the UN Security Council, inspections in place, compliance repeatedly verified. The US walked away from it in 2018, not because Iran violated it, because diplomacy was working, and that reduced leverage. Negotiations didn't fail, it succeeded, so it was scrapped. Then came economic warfare, and not the polite kind. Sanctions designed to crash the currency, strangling banks, collapsing oil exports, triggering inflation and shortages. And US officials weren't shy about the goal: destabilize society until political collapse becomes inevitable. When protests followed economic shocks, they weren't treated as tragic, they were treated as progress. That's not diplomacy, that's siege warfare with spreadsheets. Meanwhile, covert operations, cyber attacks, assassinations, and sabotage kept pressure constant. Hybrid war, everything short of formal invasion, but designed to weaken the state from every angle. Then comes the propaganda trick, creating suffering through sanctions. Point to the suffering as proof the government has failed. Use the failure to justify more pressure, and eventually war. It's a closed loop, and here's what makes that dangerous. Iran isn't Iraq, isn't Libya, and isn't diplomatically isolated or military helpless. It has missile systems that have already proven they can penetrate advanced air defences. If the state believes survival is on the line, restraint becomes optional, nuclear escalation becomes thinkable, regional escalation becomes unavoidable. And the Middle East is not a quiet chessboard. It's dense with allegiances, proxy forces, energy chokepoints, and nuclear-armed patrons watching every closely. This isn't a surgical strike fantasy. This is regional firestorm territory. And yet, Europe, who helped negotiate the original nuclear deal, has mostly stood silent while sanctions strangled it and threats replaced diplomacy. Legal prohibitions against regime change apparently optional now, which tells you something important about the world we're entering. International law isn't collapsing because bad actors ignore it. It's collapsing because powerful actors no longer bother pretending it applies to them. And that's the real link to our earlier segment. When democratic systems hollow out, the elites lose credibility. When economic pressure builds and reform blocked, foreign conflict becomes the pressure valve. War stops being a tragedy to avoid and becomes management strategy. So if tonight feels like systems turning against people at home and systems preparing to smash countries abroad, that's not coincidence. That's how failing power structures protect themselves. If you've been feeling like the global order is wobbling like a shopping trolley with one wheel missing, congratulations, your senses work. Big shifts in world system normally arrive with firewalks, wars, revolutions, empires collapsing. That's weird about now is that the ground is moving without a clean reset. China's rise has been gradual, structural, and by historical standards, unusually non-violent, and yet the consequences look anything but calm. The core question is simple. Can the drift away from Western dominance happen without a great power war? Some analysts say nuclear deterrence and interdependency keeping a lid on it. Others think we're stumbling towards confrontations precisely because the old systems are built on habits that no longer hold. And it isn't about power. It's about legitimacy. Who writes the rules, who enforces them, and claims the moral authority while breaking them with a straight face. Take the phrase rules-based international order. It sounds like a universal moral framework. The critique getting louder is that it was designed around the interests of a dominant post-1945 power, with allies benefiting so long as the arrangement stayed stable and profitable. Recently, Washington's tone has shifted from multilateralism to something more openly transactional. National interest first, allies treated less like partners and more like dependencies. That matters because it dissolves the psychological glue of the alliance system. If the order isn't shared purpose, middle powers start asking why stay loyal to an arrangement that doesn't even pretend to be fair. So they hedge, diversify, and quietly build options. The dream of multipolarity is balance and negotiation. The reality is that empires don't retire gracefully. When the dominant power senses the floor moving, it tightens control over allies and disrupts competitors everywhere through sanctions, trade restrictions, and competing infrastructure, information warfare, and political meddling. Rivalry doesn't stay regional. The front lines become wherever influence can be contested. Then comes the coercive trap. Squeeze allies. Allies feel exposed. They build alternatives. Rivals coordinate, and hegemon escalates. Instability grows. The irony is that tools used to preserve dominance can erode it faster. Underneath it all is this domestic legitimacy rot, inequality, institutions seen as self-protecting, politics reduced to messaging, and a widening gap between policy world and lived life. In that environment, strongman politics doesn't need to be brilliant. It only needs to be emotionally coherent. Someone sounds like they're driving the car, even if they're steering it into a wall. And here's the kicker. Nobody is clearly replacing the old order. Even rising powers may not want or be able to carry the burden of global enforcement the way Washington did after 1945. So instead of neat new system, we get prolonged bargaining under stress, regional blocks, coercion, shifting alignments. Undefined systems are where miscalculation thrives, which is why this era feels less like a new world order and more like a permanent argument where nobody trusts the rules and nobody is confident the rules even matter. Everybody is armed, anxious, and watching closely. Next up, Western China analysis, an industry where people who haven't updated their mental software since 2015 advise governments and markets in 2026. It's like using a Nokia map to navigate a new city, then blaming the city when you drive into a lake. For a slice of Western commentary, China is still the same story. Copycat manufacturing, export dependence, fragile markets, and tech sector that collapses without American inputs. That snapshot might have felt plausible a few years ago, or decades ago, sorry. The problem isn't academic. It shapes investment decisions, industrial strategy, and sanctions policy. When the model is wrong, the decisions get expensive. One boardroom mantra is that China is uninvestable. It spreads because it feels safe. If political risk is the headline, opting out looks prudent, but blanket conclusions often become from second-hand info loops, not direct exposure to how the economy is actually functioning. Markets don't reward vibes, they reward timing and accuracy. The more consequential issue isn't that risks don't exist, but that risks assessments are filtered through the old assumptions and political incentives. Take real estate. China's property downturn is real and heavy. Prices have fallen sharply in key cities, with deeper drops in similar small tiers. But it isn't straight replay of the US 2008 crash. Household behaviour has more historically been more equity heavy, with larger down payments, changing the failure mode. The risk looks less like sudden systematic bank failure and more like a confidence trap, depressed transactions, long selling cycles, and a broad psychological hit to perceived wealth. That mood spillover matters. You can still have massive household savings and still get defensive if you expect volatility ahead. Money stays parked, velocity drops, entrepreneurs delay hiring and expansion. Economic psychology becomes microeconomics, and it also bleeds into demographics. Uncertainty encourages postponing marriage, delaying children, and avoiding long commitments. It accumulates when then shows up as a long-term headwind. Meanwhile, self-reliance isn't a slogan, it's insurance. The goal is to reduce vulnerability to sanctions and export controls across supply chains, technology, industrial inputs, and even some categories of food and agriculture. Export controls meant to slow China have, in some cases, accelerated domestic substitution by forcing ecosystems to fill gaps faster, just like they did in Russia. And the old diagnosis, America innovates, China replicates, Europe regulates, belongs to another era. China has moved from imitation to improvement and increasingly original engineering at scale. EVs are the cleanest example. Chinese manufacturers compete not only on price, but on integrated ecosystems, software, batteries, supply chains, manufacturing tempo. Western firms weren't ambushed by magic. They were warned by reality and ignored it. Finally, the hypocrisy theatre. Western critics talk like China's success is pure subsidies, as if Western industry rose from untouched free markets. Government support has long shaped Western outcomes through defence procurement, public R&D, and strategic contracting. Often the difference is branding, not existence. The bottom line is the most dangerous mistake isn't overestimating China, it's misunderstanding China through outdated narratives, and then designing national strategy around that mistake. Now to the most Trump headline imaginable, a proposed board of peace tied to Gaza reconstruction, and people yelling, rival United Nations. Cute. Wrong. This isn't a counter-UN. It's something far more Trumpian, a personal power platform built with international law as the operating system. Here's the structure, as described in a draft charter reportedly circulated to more than 50 countries and published by Israeli media. It resembles a normal international organizational peace-building stability governance in the conflicting zones, except for one critical difference. Authority concentrates in one individual. The charter names Donald J. Trump personally as the inaugural chairman, separate from his role of US president. International organizations usually reference officers, not name humans, for that reason. From that chairman's seat, he controls who gets invited, who sits on the executive board, who gets discussed or what gets discussed, what decisions can be adopted, and what subsidiary bodies exist. Member states can vote, sure, but the chairman retains veto power over agenda and outcomes. That's not multilateralism, that's centralized control dressed in diplomatic paperwork. Gaza is the political entry point, not the structural center. Alongside the charter, there's a Palestinian National Committee for the Administration of Gaza, meant to manage civil governance on the ground, plus a Gaza executive board supervising it. Any security presence and international stabilization force would be authorized via the UN Security Council and coordinated with the board, but not integrated into the board's internal structure. The result is a stacked system: local committee, Gaza board, international board. The legal key is the UN Security Council Resolution 2803, which explicitly welcomes creation of a transitional international administration and grants international legal personality. That matters because treaty-based organizations can operate above domestic legal systems with diplomatic privileges and immunities. They can own property, open bank accounts, sign contracts, and remain largely shielded from national courts and regulatory's standard practices for entries like the UN, IMF, and World Bank. When we hit the money clause, board members normally serve 3-year terms unless they contribute more than $1 billion in the first year. Then the term limit doesn't apply. Translation: permanent influence can be purchased, peace building, but with a billionaire cover charge. The succession rules are equally on brand. Only the chairman may designate a successor. Removal is possible only through a unanimous executive board agreement in cases of incapacity. And the organization dissolves unless the chairman renews it every 2 years, meaning he can shut it down at will. Controlled longevity, not institutional continuity. So no, it's not a rival of the UN. It's a bespoke and treaty-based vehicle designed to convert political influence into long-term international infrastructure with funding flows, immunity, and personal control. Gaza opens the door. The charter language is broad enough to operate anywhere. Peace building can be invoked. If 3 states ratify, it becomes real. And when the question isn't whether there's a new world order, it's whose order it is, and yes, that should worry everybody.
We built them to optimize, not to rule.
You can't stop the future, but you can design who it belongs to. Data is power now, and Africa finally owns its own.
The system is already learning. We're just pretending to lead it.
Cities don't need governments anymore. They need algorithms. Algorithms, when you talk.
Stability isn't peace. It's just control, or that works.
Back home, we call this progress. Out here, it's collapse.
Neutrality is not weakness. It is restraint with consequences.
Once you build the corridor, everything must pass through it.
The future isn't coming. It's being built.
All right, after all that cheerful material, digital papers, speech policing, capital hostages, and AI interns auditioning for godhood, let me point out to a story that stitches these threads all together in place. The Quantum Hemispheres, Book 1, The Rise of Argo. Most sci-fi either escapes into distant fantasy or narrows into a gadget thriller. This one does something more unsettling. It reads like a briefing from tomorrow. No media wipes the slate clean. No alien invasion gives everyone a common enemy. Instead, the world simply reorganizes quietly, structurally, and relentlessly. In the rise of ARCO, power migrates away from the old post-Cold War nation-state vibe and into systems, logistics corridors, sovereign data networks, autonomous cities, regional security alliances, and a quantum-enabled layer of management that makes governance feel less like politics and more like a back-end update. At the center is ARCO, an organization that sells itself as defensive stability while becoming the backbone of global infrastructure. And that's the key. Authority doesn't show up with a flag and a speech. It shows up as dependency. Who controls the corridor? Who runs the cloud? Who guarantees shipment integrity, payment rails, and the crisis routing when old institutions are busy arguing? The book doesn't give you a single hero to worship or a villain to boo. It spreads the story across engineers, diplomats, intelligence analysts, city administrators, and cyber strategists, people who don't take over the world, but accidentally build the parts the world can't function without, which frankly is how real power usually works. The technology is present: quantum managed, logistics, sovereign clouds, algorithmic governance, but it isn't there for fireworks. It acts like pressure on human choices, tightening options, rerouting incentives, and making the line between convenience and control harder to see. You know, the modern vibe. What makes it bite is thematic restraint. The novel doesn't declare the emerging order as evil, nor does it sell it as salvation. It asks the questions that keep policy people awake at 3 a.m. What happens when stability becomes a service, when neutrality becomes industry, when efficiency replaces legitimacy as a basis of authority? The prose stay crisp, and cinematic negotiations, covert operations, infrastructure projects with global consequences paced like systematic change itself. Not explosive, but relentless. If you like the layered politics of The Expanse, the institutional realism of Michael Crichton, or the big picture geopolitics of Kim Stanley Robinson, you'll recognize the appetite of this book is feeding. By the end, it's clear ARCO isn't just a plot device, it's a concept, a world where who governs is less important than what you rely on. And once that reliance is built, resistance becomes a sentimental hobby. So yes, today's news is messy, but if you want a narrative lens for why it's messy and where it could logically go, ARCO is your map. Just don't blame me when it feels less like fiction and more like schedule. It's available now on Amazon in Australia, UK, EU, and the US, then Japan on paperback and Kindle. And it only gets darker soon. So if tonight felt heavy, that's because it should. What we walked through wasn't just isolated chaos, it was a pattern recognition, systems tightening, accountability fading, major decisions being made farther from the public than ever before. Digital control framed as convenience, elections focused on slogans, not substance, global pressure exported abroad as everything at home feels like an afterthought. And that brings us to something that's been bubbling under every conversation this week. The highly tense standoff between the United States and Iran. War isn't declared. It isn't signalled with fanfare. It sneaks up through fleet deployments, carrier strike groups pushing through the Arabian Sea, rhetoric about time running out unless an agreement is reached, and commanders on both sides saying they're ready with their fingers on the trigger. That's not theory, that's reported reality. US warships have been moved into the region as part of what officials have described as a big armada, and multiple outlets are openly talking about possible military action if Tehran doesn't meet certain demands. At the same time, Tehran is responding in kind, warning of retaliation and signalling readiness to defend itself. Now here's the twist. Even as this looks all like it's a setup to strike, multiple regional partners and analysts are urging restraint. Arab states are pushing for diplomacy to avoid destabilization, and some financial risk models suggest limited confrontation is more likely than an all-out war, because the broader conflict would be catastrophic for global markets and regional stability. What matters for this show is the bigger picture. When domestic legitimacy cracks, when internal pressure builds beyond control, powerful actors often look outward for distraction, justification, or leverage. The US-Iran situation is the most visible example of that right now. and it's unfolding exactly when elite credibility at home is already under stress with the Epstein files. Before we wrap, let's take a quick pivot to something adjacent but essential. If tonight's themes, systems replacing people, infrastructure replacing legitimacy, accountability disappearing, resonate with you, I recommend checking out the Quantum Hemispheres, The Rise of Arco book, a near future geopolitical story that explores exactly these dynamics in narrative form. The book is available on Amazon, and the links to follow its Telegram, YouTube and Instagram channels are in the description below if you want to explore the project further. As always, thank you for riding with me, thank you for supporting independent work, thank you for sharing the show, and thank you for sticking with the analysis rather than the headlines. It's me in Minsk. This is From the Other Side. And remember, when systems stop answering to people, the most dangerous thing you can do is stop paying attention. Bye-bye.